Last question. Is it possible to move forward without revisiting the past? Is it possible to move forward with this conversation without revisiting the past?
No, would be the short answer. I think about how the issues of the past in our nation continue to affect minority people today. And so it isn't just an issue of the past, but the issues of the past are affecting our friends and our neighbors and our brothers and sisters today in real, palpable ways, through both systemic injustice and through emotional pain too. And so we have to be willing to talk about what happened in our nation's history and see how the lives of people around us are still being affected today.
So do we have to revisit the past? So I have a quote here from Jefferson Davis. This is February 2nd, 1860, on the floor of the Senate. The inequality of the white and black races was stamped from the beginning. And I think it's interesting to me that sometimes, Jefferson Davis goes on and becomes president of the Confederacy, right? During the Civil War from 1861 to 1865, right? It's interesting to me how we can read things like that and we can say, oh, that happened then, right? And so that was him. He's a lone actor. I mean, what bearing does that have on the present? But what's so interesting is when you kind of trace those things and you follow them out and you see how Reconstruction right after the Civil War kind of starts, and then it abruptly ends, and there are all these lynchings at the end of the 18th century, end of the 19th century. And then finally the next 50 to 60 years is just full of case after case of injustice and all these things that happen. And it materially, substantially affects the lives of black folk, right? And we think sometimes that ends in 1968, right? But the reality is just that's not true. If we could kind of trace some of these things, I think Jesse talked about, even if you look at incarceration rates. I think I was reading somewhere the other day, like in the state of Missouri, right? And I try, and you probably noticed, like in my mind, I'm always thinking about statistics. I'm always thinking about where's the proof of these things? Part of that is because, again, this is a difficult conversation to have. And a lot of times it's almost like, well, if I don't have proof, if I don't have statistics, this thing doesn't even really exist. So be it, right? And so even now, like even in the state of Missouri, I think black folks comprise whatever percent of the state population. I think it's less than 10%. It might be even lower than that. But 40% of the prison population in the state of Missouri. And so when you look at those types of things, again, there was an article in Dallas in Dallas Magazine in October 2018, maybe November 2018. It talks about Dallas, Fort Worth, San Antonio, and Houston made a list. This is the list for the 3 most economically segregated cities in the entire country. Right here in Dallas, right? And so, if you think about that, why are we having conversations about things that happened in the past? Because they affect the present. It's impossible to understand the current political landscape, to understand what's happening in our cities, what's happening in our country without understanding Jefferson Davis on the floor of the Senate in 1860, getting up and saying to the Senate, trying to justify many things. Hey, man, listen, there are differences, real differences between blacks and whites that have been stamped from the beginning. That's racially charged language. And so it didn't just happen. We didn't just get here. We'd like to believe that, but this has been going on a long time. So.
Yep.
You go first.
For me, when I think about this question, I understand the like the climate of our country. I get that, but I personally think about the church and how we should respond as a church. And for me, one of the things that I've heard in the church said to me is that as a white person, I need to ask forgiveness or I need to ask your forgiveness for the sins of my fathers, the sins of the people in the past that have wronged your people, right, or other races. And for me, that's kind of a hard thing for me to think think about, because when I think about salvation, I think about the gospel. I think of Jesus. He is the only one that could take that on himself and to pay that penalty, right? To receive that. And so I think when I think about the church and I think about hearing that in the church and someone telling me that I need to take that and I need to ask your forgiveness, it almost minimizes what Jesus did on the cross, because I'm trying to take that onto myself and ask your forgiveness for something that I had no part in personally. And so I think the things that are happening in our country, I don't think they're right. I think there's a lot of things wrong. But I think when we look at our church, when we look at our family here, we need to look at people and realize that, like, yes, these things are happening in our country, but how do we change what's happening here in our church? How do we as Christians change what's happening in my relationship with my brothers and sisters in Christ? In and out of the church, really, but as believers, how do we respond to that? Because I can't change somebody else's response to that, right? I can only change my own. And I change my own based on the gospel of Jesus, which is that he paid for all of that. He's already done that for me. And so now I need to move forward. And yes, the past is very helpful, and we do need to look at the past, but I don't think we need to dwell on the past. I think we need to move forward as a people, one people.
Yeah, so I just want to make a comment about, like, asking forgiveness. So I kind of look at it this way, like, if you say your friends, like, were talking mess about another friend, right? You weren't saying anything, but you were in the group, and it caused a lot of hurt and affliction on that person. Wouldn't it reflect Jesus as a member of that group to go to that person and say, I'm really sorry. I'm really sorry that you were hurt, and I'm really sorry that you were belittled. And so I think that is in a very, like, layman's term way, like, because we've talked about this a lot, like, I do not have the benefit of even knowing where my ancestors are from, but I know that because I look the way I do, I have a responsibility to say, like, I'm going to pursue reconciliation regardless. And so, like, yes, he did. Jesus totally paid everything. But, like, man, wouldn't that push reconciliation further to not say, well, that's Jesus, it's on Jesus, but to say, like, no, like, I'm coming to you, I'm humbling myself, and I'm coming to you, and I'm saying, like, I want to ask you to forgive me, and forgive the things in the past. And so I think, like, for me, and it may be different, like, but if I were to take that on, I think to me it feels apathetic in that way. And that may not have been, like, what you meant, but when I think about it in my own life, that's what it feels to me. If I don't say anything, then I'm like, am I sitting in apathy, or am I making, like, real strives, like, towards reconciliation? So
I think, I think the need to visit the past can be, like, for Jesse and I being married, when I wrong my wife, I want to just fix it and let's move on. I think we must sit in that discomfort and that reality. And it takes great effort, the giant that we're trying to battle, which is our pride, which is our coming to terms, like, I did something wrong, right? And if you're not in that place where you feel like you corporately have did something wrong, then let me bring a shame and honor culture into the picture, like myself. Like, I give the story of my sister's friends being Asian. They stole from us. Their parents came to our house one evening, and they were all disciplined. The two boys who stole from my sisters was disciplined in front of the entire family, to the point where my mom, like, cried and said, stop, no more, please. And that was them coming to corporately regain their honor because of the kids' shame. And so there is this corporateness that I think my culture brings to the gospel, right? The gospel implications, we need each other, right? The problem is the diversity, but the solution is also the diversity, right? So I think that aspect we must recognize how hard it is, and secondly, the reality of, like, the past does play a role. Yeah.
When you say the past does play a role, what do you mean? Kind of, not saying you're wrong, but I want to understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I think for us to not think of the past, like for me, the good and the bad experiences of racial things that have happened to me, I don't forget those things. So when I think of my son, my black son, and he gets pulled over by a cop, I have legitimate concerns in ways that I didn't before.
So how does that connect to the past?
Because I've been pulled over and dressed a certain way and in a certain car that an officer think I'm an Asian gang, right? And he makes comments and he profiles me. In the same way he looks at my son, he's going to have certain profile in his head from his past, from what culture, the narrative of an Asian, a narrative of a black person, right? That plays a role in how we view race.
Right. So, because this is where the church is stuck. Like, how do we? You have to address this question here in order to even move forward. Like, how do we move forward? Because we can't fix the past, but there's significance there that comes from our past. I mean, it's literally the foundation for our present. You know what I'm saying? So if there's an issue with cops or if there's an issue with crime or whatever, it's founded on something. It didn't just come out of nowhere. So in order to fix what we have today, to some degree, you do have to address the past, but like, where does that end? And so I think as Christians, as an African-American person, at some point I have to say, I'm going to move forward in spite of what you do or don't do. And if I was a white person, I would say, hey, it's important that we move forward, but I'm going to have compassion and an awareness of what you're feeling like. So for each person needs something, but it's different, The white person, for whatever reason, may need to just stop and say, man, I don't feel like I'm responsible for what happened to you. That happened in the past, but I still can connect as my brother in Christ to what you're going through. And I validate that how you feel is important to me. Like, I empathize with what you're going through. And for the African-American person, I'm going to be like, hey, at the end of the day, I have to forgive. I have to move forward. So I think each group has something that they bring to the table.
Yeah, I think it works both ways, right? Like from my side, like more of my Caucasian friends are more individualistic and not so corporate. But that is a benefit in a way that I see in marriage. The leave and cleave is no problem. But in an Asian culture, the leave and cleave is probably the reason why China has the highest divorce rate, right? Because you elevate your parents so high to a point where you jeopardize your relationship, your marriage, right? So there's a negative there, right? But there's also a positive in the corporate explanation of the Bible. I think that's why we need to sit in each other's shoes and hear each other to have these conversations.
I hope that as a nation, we're not here in this place 1,000 years from now. But the reality is that we have not been having these conversations for very long. And so it's still new. These conversations are still new and still fresh, especially in the church. And I don't think we're ready to move on from that. I mean, if I look around me at my white brothers and sisters, very few of us are having the conversation. And that represents, I think, our need to sit here and continue on in talking about the past and how it's connected to today and talking about today. I think moving towards solutions is great, but I think reconciliation is still happening.
I was going to say, I don't know. It's interesting. I think because you said it's hard for the church to move forward, like if we can't even have this conversation, right? And that's so true. Like, and I think it's very true. I think one of the reasons why history is so important is, if you go to Ephesians chapter 6, right? I like to think, I tell Malika sometimes, I tell my wife sometimes, It's almost as if kind of some of the things, some of the forces that we see unleashed presently in the country. You know, I say to her, I'm like, this is ancient evil. This is not new, right? This has been around a long time, and there are things that are. And I don't mean transatlantic slave trade ancient. I mean older than that. Like this is back to the Garden of Eden. This is the serpent in between man and God driving this wedge, right? Like there is, I mean, and if we can kind of understand the scope and of what Satan is doing, right? Like the way he's managed to divide the church, to get us all turned around on what we're supposed to be doing. I mean, we can't relate to each other. I mean, everything is just thrown out of whack, right? And so the ability to have this conversation, you know, Gabby mentioned, you know, and I just feel compelled as an African American just to kind of even try to answer that question. Like, am I looking for an apology? You know, am I looking for all white people to come to me and say, I'm sorry for 400 years of chattel slavery? Like, I'm sorry, you know, and try to work that out and figure out, man, I don't even know what part my family played in this. I don't even know if I held slaves. Like, what do you want me to do? I mean, and I'm sitting here thinking to myself, what would be helpful? You know, what would be helpful, right? I think sometimes, I don't know if it's so much an apology, you know, as it is empathy. You know, there's a way to say I'm sorry without saying, like, I know for certain my fifth great grandfather on my mother's side twice removed. You know what I mean? Held slaves. Like, maybe you do or don't know that, right? But I think so many times as African Americans, it's just saying, hey, all I want really is just empathy. All I want is just for you to say, like, I'm sorry, like you just lost somebody. I'm sorry. That kind of I'm sorry. Like, I see it. Like, I see the misery. I see the pain. Like, I see what's happening. It's not all in your head. Like, I see it, you know. I don't know to what degree I'm involved in that, right? But then when we step back a layer from that, what history allows us to do is then to begin to see the way our own, like, individual narratives are caught up in this larger story of what's happening in America, right? Because there is a sense in which, you know what, man, by virtue of the color of my skin, I'm playing out a certain societal role. There's a certain part in the play that I've been given, and that thing was given to me before I was born, right? There are certain things that whiteness, that blackness, that it connotes, that they mean, and that's it. I mean, it is what it is, right? And so the question is, like, man, to talk about white supremacy or white privilege or all those things, man, so many times as the church, I feel like we get stuck there. Like, okay, we're having this conversation. Well, to what degree is any of this true? Is this any present? Are we really even, you know? But the reality of it is, if we would just go a little step further, this is my argument. Mm-hmm. And if we take the implications of the gospel, I feel like either the gospel helps us get through this and the church becomes this beloved community that I mentioned, like Dr. King was talking about, right? Either it's the truth, or we're doing something drastically wrong, or we need to follow another religion. We need another book. We just need to walk away. I don't think we should. I don't think that's right. I'm not arguing that. But what I'm saying is, either the answers are in the book or they're not. And if they are, the question is why aren't we spending time as a church having the conversation so we understand the problem, right? And then apply the medicine to the right problem. Right. I mean, the historical conversation to me is, what's the problem? And then once we figure out what the problem is, now let's get our best theologians. Man, let's not debate how many angels on the head of a pin in the seminary, right? Let's not just do that, but let's go a little bit further and say, now, racism, this is real. This is a real thing. This has been going on a long time. Cotton Mather, John Edwards. I mean, we can go into all these people, George Whitefield. We can talk about the church's historical response in North America to slavery. And in many times it was lacking. Okay, so what do we do about it, right? And the answer's right there. I said this before and I'll say it again. It's right there in the gospel. God is reconciling himself to man, and he's doing something in us to reconcile us to each other. Either the gospel works or if it doesn't. And if it doesn't, what are we doing? Right. I mean, so that's my argument. I don't know.
Can I add just one thing? Just, you know, as a white Christian, I would like to add that I don't personally think it's out of place for me to apologize for things that my ancestors did. Now, I don't know for sure, you know, like whether my ancestors held slaves or whatever. I don't know that much about my past. But I don't think that, like, me saying to you, you know, like, Craig, I am so, like this. I don't think it's out of place for me to say, you know, knowing the historical wrongs that have been inflicted on people that look like you by people that look like me, and knowing like how I benefit from the policies that have resulted, how I benefit from, you know, the wealth that has been passed down through generations, knowing, you know, what I know about like just the racial dynamics, and how that interconnects with power dynamics and with money, like in schools and government, all kinds of things. Knowing those things that I do, like, I think, you know, as a Christian, if my eyes are, you know, focused on loving God wholeheartedly and, you know, loving my neighbors after that, I think there's a place for me not only, you know, apologizing for that, but like, I think I should be lamenting over that, you know, like whether I personally feel like it's my fault or not. Like, it's kind of like John was talking about, individual versus communal, like how we process guilt or whatever. You know, I think as a white American, I've been given the privilege of thinking of myself as an individual, and what I do only affects me. But actually, I don't think it's out of place, even in the Bible, for like one person to kind of take on the communal guilt of that group that person has belonged to. So I don't think it's out of place for me to, you know, just lament and apologize for things that my people have done to your people. And I think that if we, you know, are willing to like humbly just kind of enter that posture without like worrying about, does me saying that make me look like a racist or whatever. I'm not saying that that's what you're saying, but like, I think a lot of times we're like so guarded, we don't want to just like humbly like ask for forgiveness when, like, I don't know, if you're in doubt, like, why not err on the side of like, I'm sorry, you know, I don't know, just if that makes sense.
I was just like, as Marcy was talking, I was thinking about how much we've like referenced the gospel and referenced scriptures, and you know, to go to your original question, like, you know, do we need to look at history? Well, is not the gospel like the starting point of our history, you know? So I'm like, well, we have to look at history. It starts there, you know, and then we can't start and then skip over everything and then go now and go. Gospel starts, our history starts in the garden. So we have to go back to the garden, and we have to then look from there.
It's already shorter than the first one.
Okay, so here's
Right?
here's my issue with like moving forward. When I talk to someone and they bring up like, for instance, let's take Philemon, you know, and or they talk about slavery being in the Bible, and then we talk about like moving forward. To me, I fear moving forward because I wonder, like, is there really an understanding? Because I would think as a Christian, when you see the slavery that was in the Bible and you see where we are, like what we experienced, those things aren't the same. Like, those people were kidnapped or sold. And I mean, if you just think about everything that they went through. And so my only fear is like, if you really don't understand what happened, can we really move forward? Or will we just repeat some of the things we've just come out of? Not to the same degree, but in different aspects. So that's my only fear is like I'm all for like, let's just move forward, right? But can we really move forward? Because if we're really not moving forward, then that means we should have spent more time in the past to figure out what the real issue was. Which brings me to the question, like, what is the real issue when you're talking about slavery, when you're talking about racism, when you're talking about prejudice? What is the real issue? Because if you never address the real issue, then you can't fix anything. And so what is the real issue? Besides saying sin. Okay, yes, it's sin. But what's the real issue?
The issue is a heart issue. The real issue is a heart issue. And if it wasn't, then this conversation that we're having today and the issues that are still happening in our nation would have stopped when the laws changed at the end of civil rights movement. And so the reason we're still having this conversation is because the issues from the past are still affecting people in our nation today. And the reason they're still affecting them today is because our hearts didn't just magically change when the laws changed. And so, anyway, that was probably not a very good ending, but
kind I mean, I don't necessarily have an answer to that, but when you said that, I immediately thought, when I accepted Jesus Christ into my heart changed, right? And so as Christians, all of our hearts should have changed. So I don't really have an answer to that, more of a question of if our hearts have been changed by Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit inside of us, then why hasn't our views on this issue changed?
And what about, for years, there were preachers and pastors and churches who promoted racism and hatred, and so that's where I struggle, is like changing of the heart sometimes is a process. You know, like there's a renewing of the mind that takes place and that needs to take place. So what needs to change when it comes to this issue of race? What are we missing?
I think for me, experientially, when I married a Caucasian woman, I realized how non-Caucasian I was. Just culture was staring me in the face for the first time. Things that I just took for granted. When I had my daughter choose what type of doll she wanted and started reading to her about little black leaders from the past, my heart started changing. The proximity, right? I could opt out of those black and white conversations growing up because I could dance in the middle, right? I could sit at the black table, the white table. I had that choice. Now I'm in a position where it hurts when I hear people make blanket statements about Caucasians, and I'm like, wait, that's not true. My wife is not like that. Or when I hear a non-black person say something about black folks, and it hurts my heart. All of a sudden, my heart changed. But the gospel changed me when I was 8 years old. But when I came closer into the stories of people who I love, you just feel it. You feel their hurt in ways that you didn't before. Yeah.
I'd say I think there's a certain since I remember an author I tried to read when I was young. I remember I was maybe 8, 9, 10. I remember trying to pick up Cornel West's Race Matters. And I remember the people in the church library were like, no, you probably won't understand anything in that. And honestly, I try to reread it every so often. To be honest, I still don't understand anything in it, to a certain degree, right? I mean, there are phrases in there that are a little catchy. I'm like, what is existential catharsis? Like, what is that? What is he talking about, right? But there are these other things sometimes that he says that are interesting to me, because when Cornel West, he's a professor. He's at Union Theological Seminary right now, but he taught at Harvard, Princeton, whatever. And as a black intellectual, it was just interesting to me to hear him try to get at kind of what the problem was. And he said, really, there's this, what he calls the nihilistic threat to black America. And that is what he calls this kind of pervasive, just all-encompassing sense of where there's just a loss of hope. He calls a monumental eclipse of meaning and hope, right? And so what does he mean? That means for so many African Americans, like there's just this sense, like you look around, you see the disparities, you recognize, like, I'm not wanted in this area. I had a conversation with people in my family yesterday about parts of this city that they did not go to, that, and I'm not going to name them, you know what I mean, that places that I understood just almost automatically, like, yep, I should not visit that part of this city, right? And we were talking about how some of those things are still true. There are certain places where, like, I know the police are going to pull me over, so I'm not even going to go up there, if you know what I'm talking about, right? That's as far as I'll go in terms of prepositions. But, I mean, and so the reality is, like, there's pain, like there is, and I can't speak for all black folks, you know, but I'd like to almost say that. Like, I've been in urban Atlanta, I've been in the south part of Dallas, I have family there. Like, I've been in those places, and sometimes I'm almost like, yeah, Dr. West, I see that, you know. It does feel almost at times hopeless, right? But if you really think about it, we all are kind of talking about the same thing. Because if I look at the other side of it and I say, okay, you know, what do folks who maybe kind of espouse a doctrine of white supremacy, or if we're talking about white nationalism, like what does that mean now, right? And to me, I hear the same thing. I hear this, there's this, I want my life to mean something. There's a search for meaning, for something deeper. And at the end of the day, I'm like, man, if that's not in the gospel, then I don't know what is, right? If I can't, like, again, I think about like in Acts 15, here's Peter having this conversation with people, who they're essentially saying, these people need to keep the law. These non-Jews need to keep the law. They need to be Jewish in this sense. And Peter says, but wait a minute, brothers. God chose from the beginning to fill them with the Holy Spirit, to cleanse them, to cleanse their hearts by faith, to cause them to hear and to believe. And he did the same thing for them that he did for us. There's no difference. And when James comes after it and he sums it up, he says, man, essentially, God is doing all of that for the sake of his name, right? And so at the end of the day, I'm like, man, to me, what's really most needed and what we have the kind of what the root issue is that there's this sense in which like human dignity, like my dignity, my value, my significance as a person, race got right in the middle of that and said, oh, wait a minute. Now, if you're white, you're really important. And if you're black, you're nothing, right? And the gospel comes in and it says, shh, nonsense. Everybody's going to hell. Everybody, aside from Jesus, right? Like and that's not to sidestep the issue, right? That doesn't mean that I don't read history. That doesn't mean, because I read a whole lot of history, but I find sometimes as a black person, I think I said this in another version of this panel, so many times I find, man, I can spend so much time reading history that sometimes I'll lose sense and sight of what it is that the gospel means, right? Because for me, I'm like, man, if Cornel West is right, and if in like the core of my soul, there's this sense of which I'm like, and this is hopeless. Man, then here comes Jesus saying to me, no, you have dignity, you have value, and it has nothing to do with the color of your skin. You have value and you have dignity because I saved you. And when you look across the table at that person who says, I'm better than you because my skin is white, then you look at him and you smile and you say, no, man, that's not true. You're not better than. Jesus died for you too. That's a myth. That's a lie that you believe. But it's interesting again, because what was King arguing? I'm trying to come to the white supremacist and kind of strip him of this ideal of his superiority. And at the end of the day, what am I working towards? Beloved community, reconciliation. Like that, at the end of the day, I'd argue, man, that's what we can, not what we can just get from the gospel, but that's the core implication of the gospel. And that's the very thing that, again, I'll say this is ancient evil, that Satan comes in, and he right here in the American context, like race and racial reasoning, it comes in, it just twists everything. And some people, I'm really important because of the color of my skin. Some people, I'm nothing because of the color of my skin. But the gospel comes in and says, no, your importance, your value is here, right? God has filled me with his spirit. He saved me. We're equal. God said that, so that's my thought.
Drop the mic.